Hello and welcome to Lecture 24 for Ancient and Medieval Worlds. This lecture is on the Muslim Caliphate, and it is going to be divided up into three parts. Part one is roughly going to cover some background to the Arab conquests, the early Arab conquests, and the beginning of the Umayyad dynasty. The second part will cover more of the Umayyad dynasty with its numerous problems and why it eventually collapsed and was replaced by the Abbasids. And the third part will cover the beginning of the Abbasid dynasty, its high point under Harun al-Rashid, and why it eventually began to break up into pieces and began facing rivals. So that's roughly the three parts. For those in the class, you need to listen to all three parts. All right, so last time in Lecture 23, we covered the birth of Islam with the life of the Prophet Muhammad and the Arab conquests overseen by his immediate heirs, the four Rashidun, or rightly guided caliphs, including the conflict over the succession of the fourth of these caliphs, Muhammad's nephew and son-in-law, cousin and son-in-law, Ali, which saw the origins of the split between the Sunnis and Shia Muslims. Now, this hadn't yet developed into the full-on religious difference that we're used to today when discussing Sunni and Shia, and that's because Islam was still in its very early stages of development. We're talking about here the first 200 years or so of Islamic history. Today, we pick up the story with the first two hereditary Islamic dynasties, or successors to Muhammad, the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasty. Note that caliphs do not have the same religious authority that Muhammad had. That's because Muhammad was the last of the prophets, according to the Quran. No one else could come along and become another prophet. Even Shia Muslims do not believe that their imams, imam with a capital I here, have the same kind of authority that Muhammad had. However, and caliphs do not have the same kind of authority as these imams from Shia Islam. Remember, the imams are those descendants of Muhammad via Ali and his wife Fatima, the only daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. It's worth also pointing out here that Shiites in this time period that we'll be talking about today, except at the very end of this, part 3 of this lecture, don't have any kind of political authority, but they did continue to live within the Sunni dynasties that we'll be talking about today. Both of these caliphates, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, were or retroactively are often referred to as Sunni. Like I said, these things were still being worked out, but the descendants of Muhammad, these imams, as they're going to be called by Shiites, lived within the Sunni sphere of influence. Caliphs, however, did have a great deal of religious authority, particularly in the time period that we are talking about here. Now, later on, and we'll discuss this in a later lecture, a class of Islamic scholars developed who became religious authorities. But that took several generations to really codify and organize into the class called the ulama that we'll be looking at later on. And in these first couple of centuries, during which the Umayyads and the Abbasid caliphs were particularly politically strong, they also had an enormous amount of religious authority as well. For much of the early period, which is often referred to as the classical Islamic period, the Islamic world was basically unified. Although we're looking at such an enormous territory, and if you look at the map in front of you, it's everything in the purple under the Umayyads. This is such an enormous territory, of course, that the Umayyad caliphs and later Abbasid caliphs couldn't make their power known in every single corner directly. Right? This wasn't always direct control, but there was an assumption that the caliph was the ultimate political authority during the time period we're talking about. Only towards the end of this period, in the 900s really, but maybe starting even in the 800s or a little earlier, will the central of the authority of the caliphs begin to first slip away and finally collapse towards the end of the 900s. However, even at this point, there was still an idea that there should be a single caliph, a head of the Muslim community or ummah. That remained extremely important, even as new rulers arose who were either effectively independent or eventually challenged the old caliphate for the title. And this is where in your notes you would write the caliphs become symbols of Muslim unity. This was extremely important, this idea of a universal community. We saw this was an important ideal in Christianity. That's, of course, where the modern Catholic Church gets its name, this idea of a Catholic, which is the Greek word for universal church. Only towards, like I said, but this lecture over its 3 parts will cover a good quarter of a millennium from the death of the Prophet Muhammad, and in that time, Islam, and this is an extremely important point, became established as not only a world religion, but as a world culture. So this period of political unity may come to an end by the end of this lecture, but in the process, it will forge a civilization, of diverse civilization, to be sure. Not all Muslims are the same culturally, but they share certain common cultural characteristics which go beyond simply the religion of Islam. And that is going to, the religious elements of Islam, and that is going to be a real legacy of these early dynasties. And that's really what this lecture is about, is this establishment of Islam as a world civilization beyond simply a world religion. Before we get into the Islamic empires, though, I want to talk a little bit about the political and cultural background of the Arabs before Islam and before the conquests. Arabs were not strangers to the wider Middle East and the rest of the portions of the world that we've been talking about in this class, although, of course, they were predominant in the Arabian Peninsula. Arab society was not monolithic, it was quite diverse, and it had never been unified before the Prophet Muhammad under any one political authority. Now, the classic image of an Arab is that of the Bedouin, a nomad who herds camels and goats across the desert from oasis to oasis. Now, that is, and was, indeed an important component of Arab society, and perhaps something of an internal ideal, but it's far from the only mode of life that Arabs practiced in the time of Muhammad or even earlier. Many Arabs already lived in their own urban and agricultural societies. Now, the most famous example of this today is the community around the city of Mecca. But there were other towns and indeed even kingdoms in the Arabian Peninsula, particularly in the south, where there's more rain, where it's not desert. That would be what in the modern nation we call Yemen. There were a number of kingdoms there. They had been in long contact with the other civilizations that we've talked about, like the Romans, or even further back to the Greeks, as well as ones further afield in Africa and India. The Red Sea was one of the main trade routes that connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean, and thus to India and even further along to China. And Arabs had been an important middleman in that trade, as well as producing a variety of goods themselves, particularly incense, which was very popular in religion in the ancient world. Now, most critically here, there were already many Arabs living in Roman or Persian territory or close to them and deeply involved in these imperial cultures. We've already seen that one Arab had become emperor of the Romans and was fully Romanized, Philip the Arab, who lived during the 3rd century crisis. And the name Philip, of course, is Greek, which shows how some Arabs were not only Roman, but fully Hellenized. Many other Arabs lived in and took on Roman or other civilizations' cultures to some degree. But there were also Arab client kingdoms who fought on behalf of the Byzantine Romans or the Sasanian Persians, and they were actually a critical part of those wars and conflicts that I talked about in our lecture on the Byzantines. Now, most Arabs were polytheists, but many were also Christians, Jews, or Zoroastrians. Actually, the kingdom in Yemen had at one point fully converted to Judaism. There was actually a Jewish kingdom in Yemen, the Himyarite kingdom, and this bronze statue that you can see here on the right comes from that kingdom. I'm not quite sure if that was before, the statue comes from before or after the kingdom was briefly converted to Judaism. But it also shows the sort of level of interaction that the Arabs have with the wider world. They're connected religiously, economically, culturally. I mean, the statue here shows a mastery of the form of lifelike bronze statue making that of course, was perfected in ancient Greece. So these Christians, Jewish, and even potentially Zoroastrian Arabs continued in many cases to be Christian, Jewish, or Zoroastrian even after the arrival of Islam. And in fact, there are Arab Jews and Christians down to this day. That's how, in part, Muhammad was familiar with the older Abrahamic faiths of Judaism and Christianity, for instance. When Muslim Arabs under the Rashidun caliphs conquered Mesopotamia, Syria, the Levant, Persia, and Egypt, and slowly even further as far as Spain and the edge of India, particularly under the second dynasty, the Umayyads, they united a region that had been divided for centuries between Roman and Persian empires. This had profound cultural implications by spurring interactions in economic, social, and intellectual ways. We've already seen something similar to this. This is something that I commented on when I talked about the original Persian Empire under Cyrus and Darius and so on. This was putting a number of cultures in contact with each other on a much more regular basis than they had been when these regions were divided politically. This leads really to the creation of Islamic civilization as much as the birth of the faith itself under Muhammad. Putting these different civilizations in contact with each other is going to produce a new kind of culture that's as much responsible for Islam as the Quran and Muhammad is. At first, the conquering Arab Muslims deliberately did not interact closely with the conquered populations. In several places, the conquering Arabs founded new cities from which to rule, ones that have remained important to this day. Like, for instance, the city that eventually became Cairo in Egypt. But other major cities were also founded. These are often called garrison cities because they were originally designed to to be cities for the forces of the Arab armies that had come with the conquests of Islam. These were built in Mesopotamia and Persia. Basra is a good example in modern-day Iraq. Even in places like Syria, where Arabs settled in existing cities, they at first remained apart from the local population. And that's like many conquerors before them, including the old Greeks and Macedonians, remember, who after Alexander's conquests during the early Hellenistic period formed a ruling warrior elite. But just like we saw with the expansion of Hellenization under Alexander, eventually this will cause profound changes to the local society, but not all at once, not at first. At first, there's this sense of distance. This was in part designed to prevent conflict in the case of the Arab conquests. Many of the warriors fighting in the Arab armies were Bedouin Arabs, and this was a way of keeping them from disrupting settled agriculture in the conquered regions. Rather than directly seize lands, the Arab conquerors took tax revenues. They put a jizya tax on the dhimmi. If you'll remember from our previous lecture on the birth of Islam, dhimmi are the protected ones. That is, members of the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity and Judaism, but also Zoroastrianism in Persia, who were considered to also be peoples of the book. The Arab conquerors did not force these people to convert to Islam. In fact, they deliberately avoided converting people at first because people who did not convert would still pay the jizya tax, that is a poll tax, a head tax on every non-Muslim in the population. And that's really how the newly conquering Arabs were deriving most of their revenue from these lands that they conquered. This relationship between the dhimmi and their Muslim overlords was outlined in the so-called Pact of Umar. Now, today, many modern scholars do not believe that this Pact of Umar, which is named after the second of the Rashidun caliphs, almost immediately as part of the initial conquest, almost immediately after Muhammad's death, actually goes back to Umar. It probably comes from about a century later. I included a copy of this in the handout for the previous lecture. Most modern scholars don't believe it actually goes back to Umar. It probably comes from about 100 years later, but it does seem to represent the relationship between the Jews and Christians, these dhimmi, and also Zoroastrians in Persia, with their new Muslim overlords. And the important thing to remember here is that the religious beliefs of these people of the book were generally respected. Polytheism, no, that did not count, and you would need to convert. But if you were a Christian or a Jew or a Zoroastrian, the Muslims would not force conversion. And religious beliefs were respected, but not equal. This is toleration, not equality. Conversion was not encouraged. Non-Muslims were the source of taxes, and initially Islam was seen as something of an Arab religion. More on that in a moment. Initially, the Rashidun and after them the Umayyad caliphs simply maintained the existing administrative structures of the governments they replaced, that is, the Byzantine Romans and the Sassanid Persians. Only later would Muslims develop their own administrative systems evolved from the earlier Byzantine and Sassanid customs. Now, recall from our last lecture on the birth of Islam that there was a civil war that brought down Ali as the fourth of the Rashidun caliphs. It had begun with the assassination, really, of the third Rashidun caliph, Uthman, by some of Ali's more zealous followers. When Ali refused to punish the assassins, Uthman's cousin, Muawiyah, who was the governor of Syria, who had been made governor of Syria by Uthman. Remember, one of the reasons people were mad at Uthman was that he was appointing members of his family to important positions. Muawiyah is an excellent example of this. Muawiyah rose up in revolt against Ali for not punishing the assassins of his cousin Uthman. And this initiated the first Muslim civil war. It's sometimes called fitna in Arabic. After some fighting, Ali and Muawiyah negotiated a truce. But for being willing to compromise, Ali was himself assassinated by his most zealous followers, leaving Muawiyah as the only obvious candidate to become caliph, the first of the Umayyad dynasty that lasted from his accession in 661 to 750 CE. The Umayyad dynasty continued the conquests of the Rashidun caliphs. The conquests particularly continued far out to the west, with North Africa conquered over the course of the late 600s. The Visigothic kingdom of Spain, as we saw in a previous lecture, which was divided by civil war at the time, was conquered shortly after 711 CE, when Muslim forces first moved onto the peninsula. Although the northern reaches of the Iberian Peninsula never fell and remained Christian. Spain, and what is today Portugal as well, the Iberian Peninsula, ultimately became the furthest feasible geographic limit of Islamic rule. Meanwhile, conquest continued more slowly to the east into what we would now call Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. Islamic conquests would effectively come to a halt with the end of the Umayyad dynasty in 750 CE, and would only start up again a few centuries later. But this was an incredibly large and impressive empire by any measure by this point. The Umayyads made a number of important changes early on. For one thing, they moved the capital of the empire from Mecca and Medina to the ancient Syrian city of Damascus. From that day until the present, Mecca and Medina have remained important centers of religious pilgrimage and prestige, but have not been important political capitals again. The move to Damascus also showed how the Umayyads were adopting the customs of the regions that they conquered. Damascus was much more centrally located for governing this new massive empire. Greek and Persian-speaking officials still effectively ran this empire, even if the Arabs were in charge. They did not yet have the necessary skills to govern this enormous an area, and they relied on former Byzantine and Sassanid bureaucrats. We can see this too in the building of the Great Mosque in Damascus. It replaced the old Christian cathedral, just as the old cathedral had replaced a pagan temple. The mosque is architecturally innovative in some ways, but it was built and decorated by Byzantine Greek craftsmen who knew how to build monumental buildings like this, which the Arabs did not have experience with and thus had to adapt local customs to their own purposes. You can see this in particular with the large dome over this great mosque in Damascus, which is still standing down to this day. It also includes beautiful but vegetal designs in mosaics, which is again a borrowing from what we've already seen in the Byzantine Roman style. So Damascus is a real move away from the old heartland of Arabia. It's an adoption of the local customs, but it's worth also pointing out here that this was set up within the old Byzantine territory, in the Greek-speaking portion of the conquered regions of the new Muslim empire, not within the old Persian sections. And that will come to play in the next section of this lecture, which we'll pick up in part 2.